All right, so corporate ghoul Nancy Pelosi and her wildly successful investor husband are back at it again with the insider trading, this time specifically centered around a semiconductor manufacturing bill that is about to be voted on in the Senate. And if his investments are any indication, I think that we can confidently say this bill is going to pass. So here from Market Watch, they say Nancy Pelosi's husband buys millions worth of Nvidia stock ahead of chip manufacturing bill vote. Paul Pelosi bought as much as $5 million worth of the stock. So before we get into more of the details in terms of this specific stock purchase, I want to go ahead and play this clip of Nancy Pelosi giving her response to a reporter who is asking whether or not her husband, who is consistently beating the markets, whether or not her husband is receiving insider information from her as the Speaker of the House and a representative of the public. So it's going to be really low audio here. I'm not really sure why, but I'll try to bump it up as much as possible. But let's just go ahead and jump into this clip here.
Yes, sir. I think we have to go now. One more, he said. Yes, sir.
Over the course of your career, has your husband ever made a stock purchase or sale based on information he's received?
What are you saying?
Over the course of your career, has your husband ever made a stock purchase or sale based on information he received?
No, absolutely not. Okay, thank you.
All right, so again, the question that he was just asking there was, has your husband ever used information from you as the Speaker of the House in order to make these types of stock trades? And her response to that is to just laugh it off and scoff and say, no, there's no way that I would ever, talk to my husband about, what I'm doing at my job. I mean, that's literally how stupid they think we are, that we would, believe that type of a line. But that was her response to the allegations, no accountability whatsoever. But now we're going to get into a little bit more details in terms of what purchase he was actually making here. And then I'll give you guys a little bit more context in terms of the broader corruption that is baked within the United States government. So here from Market Watch, they say the husband of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi just bought as much as $5 million worth of stock in a software and computer chip company, Nvidia, publicly available financial disclosures show. And they say, according to the disclosures, Paul Pelosi purchased between $1 million and $5 million worth of Nvidia stock on June 17th. And the stock purchases come as the Senate is expected to meet this week to discuss a bipartisan bill to boost semiconductor manufacturing in the country. The bill aims to provide grants, tax credits, and other incentives for companies to manufacture semiconductors in the United States. And we're going to get to how absolutely atrocious this bill actually is here in a second. But basically, they're just outlining the conflict of interest here that's very obvious and in your face. But here was one of the other responses that we got from a spokeswoman for Nancy Pelosi, and she said the Speaker does not own any stocks. And they say, as you can see from the required disclosures with which the Speaker fully cooperates, these transactions are marked SP for spouse. The Speaker has no prior knowledge or subsequent involvement in any transaction. So we're supposed to believe that her husband is making millions and millions of dollars in trades without her even knowing about it, without her having any input in it, and without them ever talking about the ongoing, debates that are happening within Congress that she has insider information and access to as to whether or not this bill was likely to pass. So, I mean, just completely fucking ridiculous. I don't think that anybody is stupid enough to believe this line. This is just brazen insider trading, and this is why people are trying to push for bills that would outlaw not just members of Congress, but also spouses of members of Congress from engaging in this type of insider trading. So that's exactly what it is. This should be considered a criminal behavior, at least in my opinion. But this guy, Paul Pelosi, is doing absolutely fantastically well in the stock market, even relative to other Wall Street goons. So just to point it out how ridiculous this point has gotten, here from the New York Post, they say Wall Street Bets founder debuts a fund that mimics Nancy Pelosi's stock trades. So they literally have it set up so that people on TikTok are doing this, people on the Wall Street Bets subreddit are doing this, where they're literally just copying what Nancy Pelosi and her husband are doing on the stock market and consistently outperforming even like Warren Buffett and other top Wall Street traders. So unless you're going to believe that Nancy Pelosi and her husband are just magically the best financial traders in the entire country, then not exactly sure how you could believe her line there that there's nothing to worry about, there's no corruption here going on. And immediately after I watched that clip, it reminded me of this other gem that we got from Nancy Pelosi last year when she was also asked about whether or not members of Congress and their spouses should be able to engage in this type of insider trading. So let's just go ahead and remind ourselves of this amazing clip.
Should members of Congress and their spouses be banned from trading individual stocks while serving in Congress?
No, I don't know to the second one. We have a responsibility to report in the stock, on the stock, but I'm not familiar with that 5-month review, but if people aren't reporting, they should be.
Why should
Yeah.
they be banned?
Because this is a free market and people, we're a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that.
Okay, so obviously so many different things wrong with that. Number one, she's talking about, within the context of members of Congress who didn't or who violated the Stock Act and didn't report their stock trades on time, which happens all the fucking time, okay? It's the normal for them to not report their stock trades on time. But the situation there is that there's no real enforcement mechanism. The punishment that they get for violating the Stock Act, for not reporting their stocks on time, is literally a tiny fraction of the amount that they're making from doing the insider trading. So even on what she's talking about at the beginning of that, there's no accountability measures. And so, saying, oh, well, we have to report our stock purchases, and if they're not reporting them, then they definitely should be. Well, that's meaningless. It's completely and utterly meaningless. There's no enforcement mechanism there. Definitely not criminal punishments, which we'll get to here in a second. But on top of that, her argument here that it's a free market. Number one, there's no such thing as a free market. That's a complete myth that is perpetuated by capitalists because we live in a society, we have an economy that is completely and utterly dominated by those who have disproportionate amounts of capital. So there is no such thing as the free market, number one. But even if you wanted to accept that we have a so-called capitalist free market here, then even under those confines, you are a member of Congress. You are the Speaker of the House. You are supposed to be regulating the so-called free market. That's kind of like your entire fucking job as a, representative of the American people. Your job is to regulate that free market and essentially get to decide winners and losers within the economy via the subsidies and the legislation that you pass. So the idea that like in any context this statement is acceptable, it's completely ridiculous. And she faced a significant degree of pushback on this and actually was forced to change her positioning on being openly in favor of something like banning stock trades for individual members of Congress. Now, whether or not she's willing to actually go out and get that done, I have my obvious doubts for that, but nonetheless, that was the bullshit justification that she gave back then, and this was the bullshit justification that she gave just recently. But to give you more perspective in terms of how rampant this problem is, if you guys remember back during the early parts of COVID, we had a bunch of senators and House members who were selling off stock when they were getting those inside meetings as to how bad COVID was going to be, not just for the American people, but also for the economy. They basically went they went and sold off a bunch of their stocks while they were simultaneously telling their constituents, no, there's nothing really here to worry about. Basically just, again, another form of insider trading. And yet, here from the DOJ, they say Burr says the DOJ closed insider trading probe without charges. So they let all of these people just straight up get away with this insider trading, and not just insider trading, but also insider trading done during a pandemic. I mean, they were profiting, they were protecting their own financial interests during a pandemic, while some of them, like Kelly Loeffler, my representative here in Georgia, were literally going and lying to Georgia residents about how bad COVID was going to be while she's selling her stocks behind the scenes. So, completely ridiculous. Obviously, no accountability there. But it's not just Nancy Pelosi, it's also Congress in general that consistently beats the best Wall Street traders, like even guys like Warren Buffett. Members of Congress consistently, on average, outperform everyone else in the entire market. So again, unless you're going to believe that the people that we happen to elect to regulate the so-called free market are just magically insanely good Wall Street traders, unless you're going to accept that premise, then this is just corruption. This is just insider trading, and it should be banned, if not, made to be a criminal offense, and having some of these people thrown in jail for this type of shit. But that's just on the insider trading. Now we get sort of circling back to the origins of why he was making this trade in the first place. So he was making the trade because of this upcoming bill that's going to be happening on this manufacturing bill for semiconductors here in the United States. And so I've talked about this a number of different times on this channel, but just to remind you guys about how absolutely atrocious this bill actually is, it's basically just a slush fund for some of the wealthiest corporations in the United States with no enforcement mechanisms whatsoever to make sure that they are not using this money on things like stock buybacks, to make sure that they are actually investing this money in the thing that the bill says that they're supposed to be investing it in. So here from The Guardian, Bernie Sanders wrote an op-ed. He says, let's rebuild the US microchip industry, not give a $50 billion plus check. So what is he talking about here? He says, for 2 months, a 107-member conference committee has been working to finalize an agreement on the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, the USICA, which would provide more than $50 billion in corporate welfare to highly profitable microchip industry with no strings attached. And he says there is no doubt that there is a global shortage of microchips and semiconductors, which is making it harder for manufacturers to produce the cars, cell phones, and electronic equipment that we need. This shortage is costing American workers good jobs and raising prices for families. 100% true. And he says this is why I fully support efforts to expand U.S. microchip production. But what's the problem here? He says the question is, should average Americans, taxpayers, or should American taxpayers provide the microchip industry with a blank check of over $50 billion at a time when semiconductor companies are making tens of billions of dollars in profits and paying their executives exorbitant compensation packages? I think the answer to that question should be a resounding no. And he says, let's review some recent history. Over the last 20 years, the microchip industry has shut down more than 780 manufacturing plants in the United States and eliminated 150,000 American jobs while moving most of its production overseas after receiving over $9.5 billion in government subsidies and loans. And he says, in other words, in order to make profits, these companies took government money and used it to ship good-paying jobs abroad, which is exactly what they're going to be able to do if checks are not put in place on this bill that's about to pass. And he says now, as a reward for that bad behavior, these same companies are in line to receive a giant taxpayer handout to undo the damage that they did. That may make some sense to someone else. It does not make sense to me. And he says in total, it has been estimated that 5 big semiconductor companies will receive the lion's share of this taxpayer handout. Those companies are Intel, Texas Instruments, Micron Technology, Global Foundries, and Samsung. These 5 companies made $70 billion in profits last year. So not exactly seeming like they need a government handout right now in order to invest domestically in semiconductor manufacturing. But they say in 2021, Intel made nearly $20 billion in profits. And during the pandemic, Intel had enough money to spend $16.6 billion, not on research and development, but on buying back its own stock, which should be fucking illegal, to reward its executives and wealthy shareholders. So they're not investing in domestic manufacturing, okay? If you wanted to pass a bill that would, I don't know, maybe force these companies to invest their billions of dollars in profits in actual domestic manufacturing, then go ahead and do that. If you want to pass a bill that bans the ability for companies to engage in what should be illegal stock buybacks to literally just artificially inflate their share prices instead of making capital investments, then pass that. But instead of doing either of those things, they're going to allow them to continue shipping jobs overseas while getting infinite sums of billions of dollars of taxpayer money in order to subsidize their operations, which they've chosen to ship overseas. But they say, or he says, last year, Intel could afford to give its CEO, Pat Gelsinger, a $179 million compensation package. Just absolutely fucking disgusting. And over the past 20 years, Intel spent more than $100 million on lobbying and campaign contributions while shipping thousands of jobs to China and other low-income countries. Does it sound like this company really needs corporate welfare? And he says another company that would receive taxpayer assistance under this legislation is Texas Instruments. And last year, Texas Instruments made $7.8 billion in profits. In 2020, the company spent $2.5 billion buying back its own stock, while it has outsourced thousands of good-paying American jobs to low-wage companies. And so what would be his actual proposal here? He says, in my view, we must prevent microchip companies from receiving taxpayer assistance unless they agree to issue warrants or equity stakes to the federal government. So in other words, buying pieces of these companies in exchange for billions of dollars in handouts. So getting something, somewhat of a reward for the American people for making these investments. But he continues saying, if private companies are going to benefit from generous taxpayer subsidies, the financial gains made by these companies must be shared with the American people, not just with wealthy shareholders. In other words, if microchip companies make a profit as a direct result of these federal grants, the taxpayers of this country have a right to get a reasonable return on that investment. He's 100% correct. And he says further, if microchip companies receive taxpayer assistance, they must agree that they will not buy back their own stock, outsource American jobs overseas, or repeal existing collective bargaining agreements, and that they must remain neutral in any organizing effort. So that's what it would look like if we actually had a government that was working on behalf of average working class people here, okay? So understand the difference, the multiple layers of corruption that are going on right here. You have the initial bill that's being put forward that has absolutely no checks. All right, you have an industry in the semiconductor manufacturing here in the United States that has spent years spending billions of dollars on executive pay, on stock buybacks to artificially inflate their share prices while shipping American jobs overseas to exploit cheaper labor in countries like China, shipping those jobs overseas, taking money from the American people via our tax dollars, and then we turn around and we're going to give give them an even bigger corporate slush fund with no strings attached, okay? No protections to make sure they're not continuing to outsource jobs, no protections to make sure that they're not using this money on stock buybacks, no protection for their workers in the case of, attempted unionization efforts, no protections whatsoever, no guardrails whatsoever put in place. So that's just the layer of corruption in terms of what this semiconductor bill actually is. Then you have an added layer of corruption where you have the Speaker of the goddamn House, and assuming many other members of Congress are doing this as well, but you have the Speaker of the House of Representatives, okay? One of the top members of the Democratic Party, whose husband, and therefore her, are literally profiting off of this corporate slush fund that they were passing through Congress, okay? And then going out there and pretending like, oh, it's just a free market. Oh, me and my husband, we don't have conversations about my job or his job somehow. You're not talking about the stock trades that he's making millions of dollars of your money being invested. You're not talking about, the inner workings of what is going on in Congress. It's completely fucking unbelievable. I mean, nobody should believe that. Nobody should give them an ounce of credit in this situation. These are criminals. These are criminals who work for the US government on behalf of corporate America, and they are using their positions within the government to profit for themselves.